Imagine walking down London's Oxford Street in the late 1990s. You navigate through a sea of tourists, double-decker buses, and black cabs until you stand in front of a retail leviathan. The glowing red Virgin Megastore. Hundreds of people clustered around listening stations, oversized headphones clamped over their ears as they sample the latest releases from Oasis, the Spice Girls, or Radiohead. This massive, multi-level temple to pop culture was the undisputed center of the British entertainment universe. But if you fast forward today, that retail empire is gone. The physical locations have been carved up, rebranded, or demolished to make way for fast fashion outlets and generic coffee chains. The rumor passed around is that Virgin Megastores simply failed to adapt to the times. Steve Jobs introduced iTunes, Jeff Bezos launched Amazon, and the physical record store was driven into extinction by the ruthless efficiency of the digital age. But that narrative is entirely wrong. The death of the British Virgin Megastore is a much darker and deeply complex story of corporate maneuvering, a brilliantly executed escape plan, and a catastrophic supply chain detonation that took out multiple pillars of the British HighStreet at once. This is the story of a perfectly timed corporate escape, a hidden domino effect that wiped out a high street giant, and the bizarre sequence of events that allowed a doomed retail empire to completely cheat death. Long before it became a casualty of the digital age, this brand was the absolute center of the physical one. The Virgin Megastore operated as the physical internet for music, movies, and video games during a time when finding something new required actual physical exploration. There were no algorithms curating your interests based on what you watch, and you actually had to leave your house, navigate the high street, and actively hunt for culture. Virgin engineered their megastores specifically to facilitate this hunt, building sprawling experience venues designed from the ground up to keep you inside for hours. The environment itself was built for immersion, featuring intentionally wide aisles to encourage lingering and prevent traffic jams around the most popular displays. Dramatic lighting cast a premium glow over the products, while the sound system pumped heavy bass directly through the floorboards. To complete the atmosphere, Virgin staffed these floors with people who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of obscure genres alongside an intimidatingly cool aesthetic. These workers were always ready to confidently guide you toward a niche electronic import or a rare B-side track. Even today, people fondly remember the weekend routine of catching a Saturday train into the city purely to visit a Virgin Megastore. Once inside, the main attraction was usually the import section because it was packed with region-locked DVDs and obscure Japanese video games that smaller independent shops simply couldn't source. The building essentially functioned as a massive, unsupervised youth club where a teenager could easily kill 3 hours standing at a dedicated listening post playing 5 different albums from start to finish. You could study the artwork on a dozen game cases or just soak in the heavy bass of the sound system without spending a single penny, and the staff would leave you entirely alone. This hands-off approach organically built massive brand loyalty for Virgin, ultimately laying the foundation for a highly lucrative retail ecosystem. Even though people initially walked through the doors just to hang out, the sheer volume of the surrounding inventory exerted a gravitational pull that usually convinced them to spend money before they left. Because this era coincided with the absolute peak of the CD boom, Virgin was able to capitalize heavily on the consumer frenzy. They shifted millions of units globally and used that massive influx of cash to expand their physical footprint at breakneck speed, securing premium real estate across the country to construct flagship locations everywhere from the center of Glasgow all the way down to the sprawling underground levels of Piccadilly Circus. As the calendar rolled into the mid-2000s, the ground beneath the physical media economy began to fracture. The launch of iTunes fundamentally altered consumer expectations regarding price and convenience, allowing people to purchase individual tracks rather than committing to a £15 album. Simultaneously, online retailers began weaponizing the postal service to undercut the high street on a massive scale. Companies like Play.com and Amazon exploited tax loopholes by shipping products from the Channel Islands, which allowed them to bypass value-added tax allowing them to sell CDs and DVDs at prices that physical retailers in central London or Manchester simply couldn't match, while delivering it directly to the customer's doormat. The executives at the Virgin Group saw the data materializing on their balance sheets. They watched the foot traffic metrics soften and the profit margins shrink as the novelty of the internet transitioned into absolute commercial dominance. The massive square footage of their high street palaces, which was previously their greatest asset, was rapidly transforming into a fatal liability. When faced with this, Richard Branson relied on a deeply pragmatic approach to business. His historically maintained a strict willingness to cut ties with failing ventures before they can drain the wider Virgin Group. In September 2007, Branson pulled the Virgin brand out of the UK high street entirely by selling the chain of 125 stores through a management buyout. The deal was spearheaded by the company's own managing director, Simon Douglas, and finance director, Steve Oliver. Almost immediately, the entire chain was rebranded as Zavi. The iconic red Virgin signs were ripped down from storefronts across the country and replaced with a sharp green logo. The new ownership team inherited a massive retail footprint and stepped confidently into the firing line. Douglas and Oliver assumed that their primary challenge would involve competing with digital downloads and the aggressive price wars launched by local supermarkets, completely unaware that their actual downfall was quietly ticking away inside a supply chain distribution center just a few hours up the road. Blissfully unaware of that looming threat, Zavi simply put their heads down and went to work. They had entered the market carrying a massive handicap since they were forced to rebuild national brand recognition from scratch during an incredibly volatile economic period. Yet, despite this uphill battle, the leadership team maintained a genuine optimism about their survival by actively planning to pivot their massive retail spaces slightly away from declining CD sales to focus heavily on high-margin video games and tech accessories. With prime real estate secured and an experienced staff retained from the Virgin days, they geared up for the 2008 Christmas shopping season, which is the singular event that dictates whether any high street retailer survives to see the next year. But their holiday strategy depended entirely on a single point of failure within their supply chain. Instead of dealing directly with every individual record label or game publisher, Zavi relied almost exclusively on a primary distributor called Entertainment UK to keep their 125 massive stores stocked. EUK operated as the logistical backbone of the entire British entertainment industry by managing the warehousing, sorting, and shipping of millions of media units from multiple major retailers across the country. The problem, though, was that Entertainment UK was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Woolworths Group. As late 2008 approached, the global financial crisis began tearing through the British economy and sent consumer spending into a steep decline. Woolworths was actively suffocating under massive debt to the point where it could no longer secure the essential financing required to keep its sprawling empire operational. When the Woolworths Group officially collapsed into administration on November 26th, it dragged EUK down with it. The distributor immediately froze all operations, locked down its massive warehouses, and halted its fleet of delivery trucks, severing the supply chain for a massive portion of the British entertainment sector without any warning. This sudden breakdown in its supply chain was a key factor in Zavi entering administration just weeks later. The management team immediately scrambled to bypass the wreckage by opening direct accounts with major publishers like Sony, Nintendo, and Universal Music, but the timing couldn't have been worse. The financial crash had already rendered the broader credit markets completely toxic, meaning these suppliers were entirely unwilling to extend new lines of credit and instead demanded cash up front for all wholesale orders. Zavi simply lacked the massive liquid capital required to independently stock 125 megastores out of pocket right before the holiday rush, causing this corporate gridlock to spill directly onto the shop floor. Customers who walked into the newly rebranded green stores that December expecting to buy Christmas presents were instead met with rows of empty racks and a panicked workforce standing around with absolutely nothing to sell. That complete lack of inventory triggered an immediate and fatal cash flow crisis. The management team spent the first 3 weeks of December frantically trying to secure emergency funding or find a buyer willing to inject cash into the business. But in the depths of the 2008 financial crash, investors were fiercely hoarding their capital, and absolutely nobody was interested in bailing out a massive chain of physical record stores. When those final emergency talks inevitably collapsed, the directors ran out of options. They were legally prohibited from trading while insolvent, leaving them with only one button left to push. On December 24th, 2008, precisely 1 year and 3 months after Richard Branson sold the company, Zavvi officially collapsed into administration. The timing was exceptionally brutal for the workforce, as you could imagine. While thousands of employees were preparing for Christmas Day, administrators from Ernst & Young were locking the doors and preparing to liquidate the remaining assets. The massive flagship stores that once dominated the high street were eventually auctioned off to competitors like HMV or simply left vacant, becoming cavernous monuments to the severity of the financial crash. In less than 2 years, the physical legacy of the UK Virgin Megastore had been completely erased, dragged into the grave by the Woolworths collapse. The Zavvi name, however, actually survived the ordeal. While the physical shops were annihilated, the intellectual property, the extensive customer database, and the brand name itself held significant value. The Hut Group purchased these digital remnants out of administration and resurrected the Zavvi logo as an online-only label. Today, Zavvi operates strictly in the digital realm as a highly successful e-commerce platform specializing in exclusive pop culture merchandise, limited edition steelbook Blu-rays, and licensed clothing. The brand successfully transitioned from managing massive retail palaces with enormous rent obligations to operating entirely out of highly efficient fulfillment centers. The green logo lives on today, repackaged for the algorithm and completely divorced from the physical high street empire it was originally supposed to save. But the story actually doesn't end there. While the British operation was being carved up and exiled to the internet, a completely different reality was unfolding in the Middle East. Over in the Gulf, the Virgin Megastore brand had been licensed to the Azadea Group, a massive regional retail conglomerate. When the digital revolution started eroding physical media sales globally, this Middle Eastern division recognized the changing tide early. Under the leadership of executives like Nisreen Shokher, the company understood that the true appeal of the Virgin brand was its cultural authority, and the actual plastic discs on the shelves were simply a byproduct of that influence. In an interview on The Knowledge at Wharton, Shokher shared, "Times changed, but Virgin didn't. 80% of the stores were still dedicated to physical CDs when Napster had launched and had 60 million users. I'd worked on the Napster deal for BMG and was a big believer in digital. I knew the youth were not going to buy physical formats of any kind, so we started shrinking and repositioning so the stores are not record stores, they are entertainment department stores." This newly freed premium retail space was then transformed into an immersive lifestyle destination. The store introduced massive sections for high-end consumer electronics, bringing in exclusive tech accessories that were previously unavailable anywhere else in the region. The pivot extended far beyond gadgets, and management partnered with local designers to sell streetwear, pop culture apparel, and boutique fashion directly on the shop floor. The aisles were soon filled with extensive toy departments focusing on high-ticket collectibles, board games, and premium merchandise aimed specifically at affluent young adults with disposable income. To anchor the entire experience, the company heavily leveraged its remaining industry clout to dominate the regional ticketing market. If a major international artist was performing in Abu Dhabi or a massive comic convention was happening in Dubai, Virgin Megastore served as the primary physical hub for fans to secure their tickets and promotions. That massive pivot into live events and premium lifestyle gear worked exceptionally well because it locked perfectly into the local cultural landscape. In the Gulf states, the extreme summer climate pushes daily life indoors, elevating the shopping mall into the absolute center of society. It effectively functions as the public square, the local park, and the primary entertainment district all rolled into one massive climate-controlled environment where people gather specifically to socialize, hang out with family, and be seen. Virgin Megastore capitalized heavily on this by ensuring their floors were the most vibrant and unpredictable spaces in the entire building. They shed the traditional boundaries of a record store to become a modernized entertainment department store, giving people a compelling physical reason to leave their houses. Management realized that consumers still heavily crave tactile engagement with their personal interests and hobbies. They successfully insulated the brand against the sheer convenience of e-commerce and delivered a tangible experience that a website simply can't replicate. That massive gap between the Middle Eastern triumph and the British collapse exposes a core reality of modern retail. The British High Street has operated for almost 2 decades under the strict assumption that the physical entertainment store is a completely obsolete concept. The ongoing success in the Gulf proves that survival actually relies entirely on a brand's ability to constantly reevaluate its utility to the consumer and adapt to a shifting cultural landscape. Cultural trends operate on a pendulum, and as lives become entirely digitized and algorithmically curated, a massive counterculture movement has emerged. People are experiencing profound digital fatigue. The convenience of streaming every movie ever made from a smart TV has slowly stripped the magic out of the viewing experience, and the infinite scroll has devalued the art itself. This brings us to a fascinating development in the ongoing story of the brand. In early 2025, serious reports and industry commentary began circulating that the Virgin Group was actively exploring bringing the flagship Megastore back to the United Kingdom, specifically eyeing premium real estate in central London. Here's Richard Branson talking about it briefly.
Great to see Hidden Grooves coming back again. Today, looking around, we decided on the spur of the moment to open it in New York. And we may even go as far as, of reopening some megastores, because I think, people are loving discovering vinyl again. And, Virgin could also, sell them some holidays and a few other things in these megastores.
It would tap directly into the exact same cultural energy that the Middle Eastern stores harnessed so effectively. It would weaponize the deep, lingering nostalgia of the millennial demographic while offering younger generations a tactile, physical retail experience they've largely been denied in the smartphone era. The potential return of the red neon signs to Oxford Street highlights the brilliance of Richard Branson's decision to walk away in 2007. By letting Xavi take the fatal blow from the Woolworths collapse, the Virgin Megastore brand avoided the taint of bankruptcy in the UK. The legacy remained somewhat pristine in the public consciousness, frozen in time as a beloved cultural icon of the 1990s rather than a failed business of the 2000s. The history of the Virgin Megastore proves that business narratives are rarely as clean or straightforward as we want them to be. The internet certainly changed the rules of the game and fundamentally altered consumer behavior, but the actual death blow for the UK operation was delivered by a boring, bureaucratic collapse within the corporate supply chain. The ongoing survival and expansion of the brand in the Middle East demonstrates that physical retail remains a viable business model. It requires a level of imagination and flexibility that most legacy corporations simply refuse to exercise. The operators in Dubai looked at the changing world and immediately changed their store layout to match it, while the operators in the UK were trapped in a logistics network that dragged them straight into administration. This story forces us to look differently at the empty storefronts in our own cities and towns. The businesses that vanished didn't always lose because their products were obsolete or unwanted. They lost because of complex boardroom decisions, invisible supply chain fractures, and a complete inability to read the room when the economy turned against them. But what do you reckon? Do you miss the era of spending hours browsing the racks of a massive entertainment store, or are you perfectly happy letting an algorithm curate your weekend playlist? Drop your thoughts in the comments section below. We want to hear about your best memory from the golden age of the High Street. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, give us a like, hit subscribe, and ring that bell so you don't miss the next video. Anyways guys, cheers for watching and stay curious.